Disclaimer: this episode contains information about the use and manufacture of explosives. I am not an expert on the subject. I literally just looked this stuff up on Wikipedia. I would probably blow myself up if I tried this in real life, and you probably would too. The purpose of this story is to educate and entertain. Do not try any of this yourself without training and supervision by an expert under controlled conditions, and probably while wearing a bomb suit. It should go with even less saying not to use explosives to hurt people on purpose. It's mean, and no matter how angry or justified you feel, you will inevitably end up hurting someone that you didn't mean to, and who didn't deserve your wrath, even if only by taking their friends and family away from them, and that includes you. This will cause a chain reaction of suffering, inducing more suffering in the world via the butterfly effect that you can prevent by choosing not to propagate it. If you feel like hurting yourself or others, please seek counseling, like I did when I was angry and depressed. It may take a while and a lot of work, but go easy on yourself. Having gone through it myself, I can assure you that it will get better. Thank you. Asyle, the Engineer and the Island. Week 23, Day 1. After my morning chores, I got up and checked on the electrolysis rig. I've had to keep interrupting the generator for my various projects this past week, so it's been operating an equivalent of about 11 continuous days at 200 milliamps, or 0.17 moles per day. At 55.8 grams per mole, that means I should have accumulated about 110 grams of iron, and at a density of 7.8 grams per cubic centimeter, my 10 by 10 centimeter plate should be about 1.4 millimeters thick. It's not much, but it's finally something I can use. I carefully peeled the plate from its charcoal backing, which was easy because the charcoal just flaked off, and I easily burned away the residue. Once it was clean of acid and dry, I traced out a pattern and started carefully cutting it out with a stone chisel. This wasn't too hard because pure iron is quite soft compared to something like carbon steel, but the plates were a bit thicker than I'd intended, so it still took some effort. The pattern basically consisted of two concentric rings, one inside the other, with some holes punched out along the boundary between them. This is where I'll coil wires later to make a stronger generator, as the iron has little use to me at present beyond its magnetic properties. I'll need to make several of these cutouts over the next several weeks and stack them on top of each other. Incidentally, the laminated pattern should improve the efficiency of the generator by minimizing the magnetic eddy currents within it. At the rate the rig is currently working, I should probably remove the plates from it once a week, which will be a little under 1 millimeter thick and easier to punch out, using the first set of plates as a template. Of course, at that rate, it'll take 10 weeks before I have something I can start using as a generator, and I'm not sure if I want to wait that long. So instead, I'll try to get exponential growth on my side by adding iron plates to the generator as I go, though I'm not sure exactly how much this will accelerate production. If each plate added increases the current the generator can make by, say, 25%, or adds 50 milliamps to the maximum output, up to a realistic limit of course, then for each plate added, I'd be shaving 1 to 2 days off the next one. The first plate would take 6 days, then 5, then 4, then 3, then 2, then 1, then 2 per day, then 3 per day, at which point the generator would be more than finished in the course of about 3 weeks instead of 10, with a maximum output of about 700 milliamps, though I'm not sure how realistic that is. Whatever the case, it won't make things worse, that's for sure. I didn't really have anything to lose, so I spent some time taking apart the generator and heating up the wires so they'd be easy to coil again. This time, I used some pieces of bamboo carved roughly into a square, the intended shape of the coils, and used it as a form for the coiling. This will allow me to easily slip them on and off the generator plates as I make them. For the moment, I simply used some wooden spacers to keep them snugly attached to the iron plates I had punched out already. I cut a key slot into the rotor plate so it would be easy to drive with an axle, but I had to carefully cut and attach some pieces of bamboo to hold the stator so it would remain perfectly centered about the axis of the generator. Otherwise the rotor will grind up against it, creating wear and reducing efficiency. Once I had it built though, I gave it a test and hooked it back up to the electrolysis rig, making a note on my to-do list to check it again at the end of day 6 this week. It's a good start, but I don't have enough to really start building a radio yet. I just don't have enough metals. That means I'll have to start mining again, but I want to try a few things to make it a little easier on myself first. The nitric acid bubbler has been bubbling for about 2 weeks, so I went to check on it. Normally, this reaction causes nitrogen and oxygen in the air to combine at high temperatures into nitric oxide, or NO2. When nitric oxide is exposed to water, it reacts with the water to form nitric acid. I had the rig set up to recirculate any unreacted gases, while effectively distilling the desired products back into the solution. But the resulting acid was much weaker than I expected it to be, and wasn't the characteristic yellow or red color of concentrated nitric acid, though that wasn't necessarily surprising. I wasn't entirely sure I'd gotten the acid right at all, so I decided to subject the solution to some fractional distillation to see what I had. What I got, among other things, was a few drops of fuming red solution that looked and smelled basically like distilled hate, a perfect precursor for explosive compounds. It came out of a lower spigot on the fractional distiller than I was expecting, which explained why recirculating the reaction products through the bubbler didn't work. Nitric acid must have a lower boiling point than the other compounds in the solution, which appeared to be a weaker kind of acid, and possibly ammonia as well. I needed a lot more nitric acid, so this time I set up the bubbler again, but this time attaching the fractional distiller to it, so that I could remove the nitric acid as it was being formed, and leave everything else to recirculate. While I did this, it occurred to me that the oxidization of ammonia vapors should also produce nitric oxide, and perhaps more readily than nitrogen and oxygen alone. So instead of simply letting air into the bubbler, I started it with a solution of ammonia to see if that would speed up the next round of nitric acid production. In the meantime, with the small quantity of nitric acid I had, I decided to begin some chemical experiments with it. The first and simplest was to just add some plant material to it, in this case a few scraps of paper. I expected the nitric acid to convert the cellulose in the plant material into nitrocellulose, otherwise known as gun cotton or smokeless powder, a nice alternative to making traditional gunpowder, which I could probably do, but this stuff's more powerful and a bit more convenient. However, it wasn't as easy as I initially expected, because although the nitric acid was clearly doing something to the paper, the reaction was occurring very slowly, and I didn't want to risk heating it up to try and speed up the reaction. It didn't really look like what I remembered seeing on TV either, with evil red juice smoking furiously when it touched the fibers. It seemed like it needed a little something more, so I tried adding a few other compounds to see if they had an effect. Sulfuric acid was the first I tried, and it immediately did the trick. Apparently, it acts like some sort of catalyst for the reaction. Once I was convinced that the reaction was complete, I let the nitrocellulose dry out for a while before giving it a test with a smoldering stick, causing it to burst into flames instantly with a whoosh and a puff of pale white smoke. For my next trick, after lunch, I decided to start experimenting with making ANFO. My understanding of the recipe, mostly from Mythbusters, was actually pretty simple, as it was baked into the acronym, ammonium nitrate and fuel oil. So I mixed up a tiny batch of ammonium nitrate by simply mixing some of my spare ammonia with nitric acid. This reaction was exothermic though, which set the ammonium nitrate off all by itself. Fortunately, it was such a small amount that I didn't hurt myself, and I tried again, this time mixing the ingredients in a cup immersed in a pot of cold water. I then carefully pulled the water out of the mixture using low pressures from my diaphragm pump, leaving a few grains of white solid behind. I was careful to only create small quantities because it was, after all, an explosive. Next, I needed the fuel oil, but I understood the reaction to be pretty versatile and that just about any hydrocarbon would do. In my case, I used a few drops of creosote oil and mixed it all together. The correct ratio is about 94:6 ammonium nitrate to fuel oil, which I know for perfectly innocent reasons, though I probably added a little too much oil just because I had so little ammonium nitrate to begin with. Probably didn't hurt the reaction as much as it slowed it down. However, I quickly realized that this wouldn't be enough to make the ANFO explosive. One of the beauties of industrial explosives is that they can't explode for just any reason. They need a shockwave from a smaller amount of higher explosive, that is, blasting caps, to set them off, making them safer to work with. Blasting caps typically contain some kind of high explosive that's easy to set off in small quantities, and one of the compounds I was aware of happened to be silver nitrate, the stuff I was trying to make mirrors out of. However, I didn't have any left, and it's more valuable to me for optical instruments anyway, so that left me with only one other compound that I could think of: nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin is, of course, a well-known explosive compound and infamous for being set off just by looking at it funny. Like ANFO, the recipe is kind of hidden in the name: nitroglycerin. The nitro, again, comes from nitric acid, and I remember hearing somewhere that I could improve the reaction by adding some sulfuric acid to it, probably like I did for the nitrocellulose, so the nitric acid doesn't need to be super high purity. The glycerin part comes from plant and animal fats. In fact, now that I think of it, it's a byproduct of soap making, so I should still have plenty lying around from making my island soaps. I first purified the oily glycerin from some of my soap by straining it through charcoal and floating it in a bamboo tube of water to help separate the different kinds of oils that may have been dissolved together, before carefully mixing it with nitric and sulfuric acids. This part of the reaction was aggressive and exothermic too, detonating itself again, so I had to start over and mix the materials in a bowl of cold water again, adding the glycerin one drop at a time, dipped into a small piece of wood or hair before gently mixing it with the few drops of acid I was working with. However, in order to be able to work with it safely, I remembered that nitroglycerin needed to be diluted with something to help keep the molecules apart, reducing the speed of a chain reaction. So I added a fair amount of ethanol to the mixture. Once the glycerin didn't seem to be adding anything to the mix anymore, I concluded the reaction was finished, and I had nitroglycerin, as if it wasn't obvious when I blew it up the first time. I took out a drop of the mixture and carefully drove the ethanol off with heat, concentrating the nitroglycerin again, before testing it by hitting the drop with a stick from across the room. It took a few tries before I finally got a mixture that went off when I hit it, with a loud bang and a puff of white smoke. It was lots of fun, especially since I was already high-strung from handling the stuff. I could probably use the nitroglycerin alone to make explosives for mining, just mixing it with a little ethanol as a desensitizer and clay as a binder to make a stick of dynamite, but it's just too unstable for my liking. Instead, I mixed a little bit of the nitroglycerin with my ANFO powder and tried setting it off. Again, it took a few tries to get the recipe just right, and I was only working with a few drops at a time. But although I could only measure the relative strength of the explosions subjectively at first, mostly by how loud they were, the nitroglycerin did appear to set the ANFO off eventually, though it was hard to tell the difference between an explosion and the reactants just being scattered across the lab. To that end, I decided to make my experiments a little less subjective by building an explosive force measurement tool, an explodometer, or boomometer if you will. I partially hollowed out a piece of bamboo and wrapped the bottom half in rope, especially around the end where the partition would make it weakest to an explosion. I then slid another piece of bamboo inside it like a piston and put a weight on the top, holding it all together with a rubber band and tying it down to something sturdy. Finally, I put a little charcoal on the stem of the device so it would leave a mark telling me how high up the piston moved with each explosion. I carefully weighed out different quantities of explosive compounds before carefully pouring them into the bottom of the cylinder and inserting a thread soaked in nitric and sulfuric acid to make a nitrocellulose fuse. It wasn't entirely reliable, but when it worked, I did get some numbers I could write down to confirm that the ANFO was detonating and making the explosion bigger than the nitroglycerine alone. Once I have more nitric acid to work with, I plan on making some nitroglycerin blasting caps big enough to set off an amount of ANFO, but small enough that they won't kill me if they go off by accident. For now, however, I have a few more hours before the end of the day, so I'll finish the program I started making for the music machine last week, as it should help me calm my nerves a little after playing with high explosives all day. Then I'll clean up after myself and get ready for bed. Week 23, Day 2. When I got up in the morning, I checked on my nitric acid bubbler to see how much acid it made, and whether it would be practical to keep using. The bubbler was sort of based on the Birkeland-Ide process of nitrogen fixation, though it's burning ammonia into nitric oxide, and then nitric oxide into nitrogen dioxide, instead of just using straight nitrogen and oxygen from the air. And the original Birkeland-Ide reactor spread the arc out into a disk for a larger reaction surface area using a magnetic field, which I obviously can't replicate right now. Still, when I measured how much nitric acid the bubbler was producing, compared to how long I'd left it running, I calculated it was producing about 12 grams of nitric acid per hour, which was frankly pretty impressive. Even though it was just a dilute solution, it was much more than I was expecting. At that rate, I should be able to produce 288 grams of nitric acid per day, and about double that mass of ANFO per day, or 576 grams. Probably pretty close for nitroglycerin too. At the end of the week, I could have 2 to 3 kilograms of explosive, or enough at the end of each day to blast an appreciable chunk out of some mineral veins. I decided to make this my project for the rest of the week. I didn't have quite enough saved up from overnight to start making much with, so after my morning chores I just started by soaking some more string and bamboo cord in what acid I had to make fuses, experimenting with the ratios of nitric and sulfuric acid to get the recipe right now that I had more to work with. I found that the cord actually worked best after a few minutes of soaking, because the outside turned to nitrocellulose, while the inside remained a flexible core for the nitrocellulose to stick to, which was otherwise very flaky and brittle on its own. I then started working making a safe storage and delivery system for my explosives. I remembered watching an episode of Dirty Jobs and seeing miners pour ANFO down into deep holes that they would drill into the wall of a salt mine to blow it out. And while I didn't think I could drill that deep, I figured I could make something similar, but a little safer and easier to contain than great bags of explosives to leave lying around. I got some bamboo, cut it into sections, and hollowed it out to make what looked like sticks of dynamite, which I would fill with ANFO instead. These discrete packets should make them easier to use and safer to store, since heat or shockwave in one would be less likely to set off the others. Plus, the rigid container should force some additional pressure buildup. On the topic of pressure buildup, though, it occurred to me that most of the expanding gases from the explosion are just going to want to go out the holes I plan to slide the stick of dynamite in through. So I made a mental note to bring some concrete with me to seal the holes, and perhaps let it set overnight before setting the explosives off, for greater effect. I needed to see if the fuse would burn through the concrete though, so I made a small mix and ran a few strands of fuse cord through them to test later. Once that was done, I set the empty tubes aside and began making some modifications and reinforcements to my hand drill, so I could use it to drill pilot holes in the rock to blow all the ore out of the larger mineral veins. The main thing that I anticipated wearing down on this machine was whatever stone drill bit I end up using, which would wear down as fast as the stone it's drilling. So I prepared several blunt bits, because making them sharp would just cause them to chip when they encounter the stone wall. I reinforced the frame in a spring too, so it could basically hold a longer charge, and so I could have a little break between stopping to wind it back up. Once this was done, I decided to head out to one of the lava tubes and drill out my first blasting hole ahead of time. I picked out a spot where I'd been mining for copper before, but was only able to scrape and chip away at the surface deposits with my pickaxe. I spent at least an hour drilling into the wall by lamplight, and it was hard, sweaty work, but not nearly as much as swinging a pickaxe all day. Also, while you wouldn't think that rock has a smell to it, the process reminded me of that upsetting smell you detect at the dentist's office when they're drilling a hole into your teeth. Ground silica, I guess. Eventually, I got a nice hole about a foot deep for my explosives. I was ready for a lunch break at that point, and when I was done, the concrete had set enough for me to test the fuses. Because nitrocellulose is self-oxidizing, I was pretty confident the fuses would work, even through concrete, though they weren't always reliable. Sometimes it took longer for the fuses to burn through, sometimes it didn't burn through at all. So, if this happens when I try to set off my explosives, I'll wait at least an hour after setting off a fuse before checking to see if the explosives failed, just in case it's a slow burn and goes off in my face if I walk over and try to fix it. Another lesson from the Mythbusters. I had just enough nitric acid at that point to start making my explosives. I started with the ANFO as before, being careful to keep the reactants cool during the reaction, and to mix everything up in several separate small bowls, so if one went off, I would only lose the one small amount instead of blowing up the whole lab. Once the water had evaporated off, I scraped the powder into my prepared tubes. Next, I started making the nitroglycerine blasting caps with the same general procedure, taking my time and keeping the mixtures very dilute before mixing in taro flour as a binder and gently pressing it into a small sausage surrounding the end of a fuse. I obviously wasn't about to put the blasting caps into the explosives yet. Once I figured everything was pretty much done, I took my explosives to the hole I drilled earlier today and sealed it in with several additional fuses, just in case I needed to relight it. I sealed it up with a concrete plug and left it to set overnight. I'll set it off tomorrow morning. Week 23, Day 3. They say it's better to end with a bang, but today I started with one. After I did my morning chores, I brought what equipment I thought I might need to the lava tubes and set up my fuse. I noted how I didn't feel as excited today as I probably should have, given what was about to happen. Part of it may have been from imperfect sleep last night, but the larger part is probably that I was thinking about everything that could have gone wrong, and was trying to keep a cool head. Honestly, explosions and fireworks have never been all that appealing to me. The only excitement comes from the fact that it could kill me if I'm not careful. I couldn't let that happen, so I had to be careful. There was also a big part of me that didn't fully expect the explosives to work, and I figured I would probably have to sit tensely for the rest of the day waiting to see if it went off on its own. I finally finished extending the fuse as close to the entrance of the cave as I could, having basically wired all the backup fuses to the main fuse so that if the fire made it that far, at least one of them would set off the blasting cap. I then lit the fuse and ran like the wind toward the cave entrance. At that distance, it probably didn't make much difference, but it was better to be safe than injured. The flames flew down the string much faster than I could run away, like the trails of black powder you sometimes see in old cartoons, until I hadn't even quite made it to the exit of the cave yet, and wasn't expecting it to go off so easily, or to go off when it did, so my heart definitely got pumping, and I tripped a little. The combination of the two made me start laughing in a half-nervous way, before I went back to check on the damage I'd done. By lamplight, I could see that I basically took a crater out of the wall of the cavern, the crack being bigger around where the ore vein was, because the boundary between the different kinds of rock was where the wall was weakest. Rocks of all sizes were littered all over the floor around the blast site, so I did my best to sweep up most of the ore into my backpack to carry back to base for crushing. I honestly didn't expect the explosives to work as well as they did today, so I only placed one explosive charge yesterday, even though I made enough explosives for a couple of charges. So I spent a couple of hours drilling some new holes for them, wiring them up, and grouting them in before heading back to base, again, quite tired and ready for lunch. Once I had a bit of a break, I started working on preparing another round of explosives, same as yesterday. However, I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that making explosives by hand, whether you're in a lab or on a deserted island, was a game of Russian roulette. It was only a matter of time before I made a mistake and started losing body parts. Of when, not if. So I tried to think about some way to make explosives without having to be in the room. I took some time to chop up several small bamboo cups and mounted them to a frame that would allow me to turn them all over at once, with little caps over the top with narrow holes in them that would cause them to drip slowly into larger cups below. They were all immersed in shallow bowls of water, but I would like to make a clay trough later. The idea is that by dividing the mix into dozens of smaller reactions, each one is, again, less likely to set the others off. Furthermore, all I'll have to do is pour one reactant into the top cups, the other into the bottom, and turn the whole apparatus over from a safe distance and wait. This will also, sort of, help me make a lot at once, though that's generally to be avoided with explosives. I certainly won't be using this apparatus indoors, but at the same time, I'm going to try to keep it out of the sun. I tested the drip rate with water before filling it with the requisite reactants. While I was getting on with making the fuses by hand, I occasionally heard a sharp bang from around the back of the lab as one of the reaction cups went off on its own. But fortunately, none of the others, and most importantly, not with me nearby. It was a good thing that the mixing cups were larger than the pouring cups, and that there was a gap between them for the expanding gases to escape through, rather than shooting acid around like a water pistol. One problem, though, with using bamboo cups is that the nitric acid ate away at the cellulose a bit, so I'll have to make a clay substitute for this apparatus later. Once the ANFO mix was done, I poured out the remaining cups for vacuum evaporation, another thing I could stand to automate, before moving on to nitroglycerine again, which went off much more frequently than the ANFO, in spite of my attempts to dilute it with ethanol. Still, I had most of my explosives prepped and ready for tomorrow, and a bit earlier than yesterday to boot, so I had time before the end of the day to make some clay replacements for the mixing rig. I made the dripping tubes a little more sophisticated, with a little grooved spout and a very tiny hole, so solutions would run down into the mixing pots very slowly and gently, being conveyed mostly by capillary action. For the mixing pots themselves, I found myself experiencing a bit of a conflict of interest, because I wanted to make a way for them to be automatically evacuated by being attached to a vacuum manifold connected to the bubbler pump in the lab. But I also needed them to be open enough to give any accidental explosions a place to go. What I settled on were a series of cups with a hole in the bottom where I could attach my bamboo containers, and a bunch of little lids that I could put on top of them and connect to the manifold. This way, the ANFO tubes could be filled automatically as the solution was mixed and the water was evaporated off, without me having to touch any of them until they were finished. This risks them becoming waterlogged by the cold water bath surrounding them, but a thin rubber seal should prevent that. I can do the same sort of operation with the nitroglycerin blasting caps, using a smaller mold that I can easily split open to remove the core of nitroglycerin in the center. For tonight, though, once I was done forming several of these little pots and tubes, I left them to dry next to the solar kiln before going to bed a little late. I was also going to need to make more hose for the vacuum manifold. Week 23, Day 4. I set my pottery in the solar kiln before doing my morning chores and heading out to the mine to repeat the same process I did yesterday. This time, though, the explosives didn't go off, and my heart started racing a bit again. Still, I knew what the proper procedure for an event like this was. Walk away. Kind of the same procedure I use for dealing with volatile emotions now that I think of it. I set the timer on my pocket watch for an hour, and walked back to base to try and find something to do to take my mind off of waiting for the charge to go kaboom. Between all the chemistry experiments I'd been doing, and having to do large batches divided between several pots at once, I found that I'd started running low on pottery again, having had to borrow dishes from the kitchen. So I spent my waiting hour making an assortment of large pots, medium pots, small pots, and dishes that I could use in the kitchen or lab. When my alarm went off, I set them out to dry and returned to the cave, tentatively following the trail of burnt fuse. I was tense, but it wasn't like there was anything I could do to keep the bomb from going off by the way I walked, nor was there any way for me to run back in time if it did decide to explode. Fortunately for me, I found that the fuse had just failed halfway to the bomb, telling me I needed to make some adjustments to my manufacturing methods to make sure this wouldn't happen again, or at least wouldn't happen often. I fixed it with some spare fuse and relighted it. This time the bomb did go off, and I could breathe a sigh of relief as I went to collect the ore and place the next round of charges for tomorrow's blast. I had a late lunch after all that excitement, and pulled my explosive mixer parts from the kiln, naturally letting them cool completely before assembling the apparatus. I made the manifold for the lids by basically fixing them to a jointed, hollowed bamboo pipe, so I could pick them up and put them down all at once and keep them evenly spaced. A little latex on the insides of the lids made a good gasket for them. I didn't have time to make a new hose today, so I just borrowed the hose from the garden, as it would survive being without water for a day, and connected the hose to the bubbler pump through one of the floor vents leading outside. This would also help me recycle any unreacted nitric acid or other vapors. The machine certainly helped me crank out the explosives while leaving me free to do other things, like improving my fuse manufacturing process, this time using a thicker twine of cord so it would have a stronger core to flex around and more nitrocellulose to set off if something goes wrong again. I even dipped it in latex to keep the nitrocellulose from flaking off. I only had to stop every now and then to swap out the reactants or start pulling the vacuum on them. I ended up having a little extra time at the end of the day, and I decided to build a proper water trough for the explosives manufacturing machine. Since I was still using pots, and a larger body of water would be able to absorb more heat from the reactor and stay cooler for longer. However, I needed to build a bamboo box to hold the clay trough, and my axe broke again yesterday, and I hadn't had time to fix it, so unfortunately that was all I could really do before it was time to go to bed. Week 23, Day 5. I started my pots cooking in the morning, and set out for the mines once again after my morning chores. In spite of the fact that this was starting to become routine, and I was almost starting to get good at it, the tension of setting a bomb and lighting the fuse didn't seem to go away, which is probably a good thing. Fortunately, there wasn't a repeat of yesterday's failed performance. The thicker fuse seems to have done the trick. I collected my ore, drilled my holes, and set my charges for tomorrow, same as yesterday, before having lunch and starting the next batch of explosives. While the explosives mixed, I prepared that spare hose I needed and left it out to dry, though I still had to keep stopping pretty regularly to refill the nitric acid, close the lids, or change out the bamboo cases. This gave me an idea for one more thing I could do to automate the explosives mixer. When the device was done mixing my explosives for the day, I mounted the lid manifold on a hinge and attached it to one of my clocks, such that when the alarm went off, instead of ringing, it pulled a support out from under the lids and let them lower gently onto the mixing bowls. I'd gotten pretty good at this point at measuring how long it took for the reaction to complete, so I set the clock to go off at about that time, though I would prefer not to put my clock right next to some explosives. At the end of the day, I finally made the water trough, and to make things easy on myself, and so I wouldn't have to fire any more clay, I just lined it with concrete to make it watertight, leaving it to dry before I went to bed. Week 23, Day 6. I decided to make this my last day of blast mining for the week, but I've already collected more ore in the past 3 days than I was able to collect in a whole week of pickaxe swinging, mostly copper. I decided to hit a vein of iron pyrite for my last move this week, and fortunately for me, this bomb went off without a hitch too, and I collected my ore before going back to base and separating what I'd extracted from the ore crusher already. In all the excitement of working on the explosives, I'd completely forgotten about the electrolysis project for the dynamo core. Fortunately though, I had it marked on my calendar, so when I was done playing with my ore, I spent some time pulling the plate from my electrolysis rig, chiseling out the pattern, and recoiling the dynamo to receive the additional core plate, hopefully with a bit more current this time. I glued the plates together with resin, and made sure they were coated on all sides to protect them from corrosion or potentially shorting the coils in the future. I had my lunch and decided to spend the rest of the afternoon smelting my copper ore so it would be ready for me to start working with next week. I broke out my crucibles, molds, bellows, and wire pulling apparatus and got cooking. For the projects I had in mind, I pulled 2/3 of my copper ore into wire, experimenting with trying to get the wire as fine as possible so I can get the most turns on my dynamo coils if I find I need to reinforce them later. The remaining third I simply poured into molds for solid plates, as there were other copper electronic components I want to make that wire won't be adequate for. I wasn't able to smelt all of it before the sun went down, so I cleaned up after myself and called it a day. Week 23, Day 7. It's my Sabbath, and after a week of tough drilling and nerve-wracking bomb making, I was ready for a little break. I spent the morning making another reel for the music machine and programming a new song for it, appropriately, Bombs by Adhesive Wombat. I'm getting quite a selection now, which is generally a good thing. I then had lunch and took a break in the afternoon to do some writing and drawing in my notebooks, but I started getting into it, and before I knew it, the sun was going down, which I didn't really mind. It's been relaxing work, and it kind of occurs to me now that I haven't been as worried about the smugglers coming back today. For the first time in what seems like ages, it hasn't been floating around in the back of my mind during leisure work. Blooper Reel. Kaboom. This is where I'll coil the wires. This is where I'll coil wires. That's hard to say. But I want to try a few things to make it a little. The pattern basically consisted when nitric oxide, as it should help me calve my. To that end, I decided to make my with a whoosh and a puff, with a whoosh and a, with a whoosh, though it's burning ammonia into nitric oxide, and then nitric oxide into to make what would end up looking like sticks of dynamite be filled with ANFO instead. Typos. Alright, let's try that again. So I could use it to drill pilot holes. Did I just say pirate holes? It's pirate-sized. I obviously wasn't about to put the blasting caps into the explosives yet. Excuse me. Kaboom tight. I took some time to chop up several bamboo. I take. In all the excitement of working, in all the excitement of working on the explosives, in all the excitement of working on the explosives. For the projects I had in mind, I pulled two-thirds of my copper. I pulled two-thirds of my copper ore into wire, experimenting with trying to get the wire as fine as possible so I can get the most turns on my dynamo coils if I need to reinforce them later. That was a bit of a run-on sentence. Air! Need air! I then has lunch. I had a cheeseburger for lunch. Let's fix that typo, shall we? Let's try that again. Hey there, thanks for listening all the way to the end. I certainly had a blast mining this week, but now I should have all the metals I need to start building that radio and getting out of here. So, if you want to see how that goes, you can press the subscribe and bell buttons to get notified as soon as the fuse finishes burning down. Now, I don't expect these videos to really blow up on YouTube, but it would really help me out, more than anything else, if you could share this video with someone who you think would enjoy it. And since you enjoyed it enough to watch it this long, you can press the like button if you thought it was dynamite. If you did, thanks, you're the bomb. There's also a dislike button you can press if you thought it was more of a damp squib. But that would really sabotage my efforts here. All my dreams would go up in smoke. Why'd you drop a bomb on me, baby? Also, if you'd like to share some of your own stories and perspectives on the episode, maybe about a time you made fireworks or the like, and some advice on how to make them much more safely than I did, or about anything you like, please feel free to share them in the comments below. I'd love to hear them, and I'm always open to suggestions and corrections. That said, thanks again for listening, and hope to see you here again next week.